Okay, woohoo! Hello, everybody. I'm Jason Karp, Esquire, with the Public Safety Network. Here with this week's edition of PSN Now, News of the Week. Let's get right to it. Massachusetts and Hyannis. We got a lot going on with COVID, street closures, construction, using streets to expand restaurant use. And with that, we find vehicles and public safety harder to get around. So how did they respond? Bike patrols, new bike patrols, 2 wheels, and particularly on weekends, high peak seasons, high peak times, they're able to navigate through the city more quickly, even though they're experiencing lane closures and road closures everywhere. It's the way I like to see the thinking. I like to think creatively. I'd like to see the creative thinking. You know what I'm saying? So kudos to you, bike patrols. Let's think about other ways that we can get around easier. I'll tell you, the one thing about the lockdown, that traffic was really nice. But, people are out and about now. We got it different. We got to be able to get around. We got to be able to protect people. Speaking of COVID, and I said, did I say nice? Because in Nice, or I should say Nice, France, police are now pairing audio and video surveillance throughout the city in order to enforce COVID restrictions. So here I am walking down the Champs-Élysées saying, whoa, check out that cool leather jacket. And I don't have my mask on. And all of a sudden I hear the police saying, yo, Jason Karp, Esquire, put on your mask and socially distance. And I'd be like, oh, I better put on my mask. So, of course, that'll be in French because it's in France. But interesting. Two-way now communication, or at least audio communication with video surveillance to protect against COVID. If there are violence, if there are disputes, if there are drunkenness, they can see it, they can speak, they can let law enforcement's on the way. And they're using pre-recorded announcements at other times to remind people to follow the guidelines, socially distance, wear their masks. It's pretty interesting. Sometimes people just need to be reminded and know somebody's watching. I hate to say that, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but, we're all in this together, and, this is another interesting approach. So very interesting what they're doing in Nice, France. What's going on in tech? Florida, as we know, they have a statewide communication system. We've talked about the fact that they did not enter into agreement that they were originally supposed to with Motorola back in December. Motorola refused to enter into that agreement because they didn't want to agree to the terms. So Florida extended the current L3 Harris contract for the time being, but with the idea that the next procurement is going to incorporate next generation technologies. So they have now hired a company called Federal Engineering. And Federal Engineering is hired to do this study, which will be complete in 2021, and provide recommendations on the report about new interoperable technologies to Florida for its implementing its new system. And of course, this won't be done before the existing contract's up, so there'll have to be some extension of the existing L3 Harris. But it's interesting because what does it mean when we talk about new and emerging technologies and next generation networks? There's, folks are scratching their head in Florida like, well, what does that mean exactly? P25 is not particularly regarded as a next generation technology. So there's a lot going on out there, right? So you've got, of course, LTE. And so the question is, does that include LTE? Are they going to consider LTE and mission critical push to talk over LTE? We know there's still some limitations with that, and that's just coming out. Well, FirstNet's got that, and Verizon has made an announcement. They're going to have mission critical push to talk coming out in the fall. So that's one. But then we've got things like satellite and what we call always on push to talk, which is a way you can extend your radio network and even push data by leveraging satellites and not have to build out additional infrastructure at a much lower price at a subscription fee. I know they're doing this down in Australia. A company called Wireless Innovations is doing this. Companies here locally are looking at leveraging satellite, like Inmarsat Government. Chimera, which has a very cool flat profile auto-tuning satellite dish that goes on top of vehicles. So when you start thinking about that and integrating LTE and integrating radio, and then other technologies like, ProSay, so you can have direct mode, and that may not be right for prime time, but what about things like mesh? And there are some great mesh technologies coming to the marketplace that are going to enable device-to-device and very long-range node-to-node communications where you don't necessarily need a radio network. Of course, LEO, a couple of years away, we're going to see some of these LEO satellites, rocking and rolling in 2022, 2023. And you're going to see new technologies where you can leverage, your existing infrastructure. You don't have to buy satellite phones. You can use your smartphone, and you can use that over satellite. So be very interesting to see what Florida does. It could go one of two ways. I'm hoping that they're going to be progressive and they're going to use this as a way to integrate multiple technologies to future-proof the network from a communications perspective. I get concerned if they're just going to put in a brand new statewide radio network. And don't get me wrong, I understand how valuable radio is, but that doesn't provide a path for truly interoperable, future-proof communications going forward, particularly broadband. So keep your eyes on Florida. Federal Engineering is the company that's been brought on to provide the recommendations and the analysis. So we should know more, hopefully, within the next 6 to 12 months about what they're going to do. But it'll be very interesting because they have one of the largest statewide radio systems in the country. Speaking of Motorola, Motorola recently purchased Pelco, video security hardware and technology provider, for $110 million in cash. They've been around for many, many years. And they're adding it to their current video portfolio that consists of a Vigilon, Indigo Vision, and of course WatchGuard, all the recent acquisitions of Motorola in the last 3 years. So clearly they're putting a lot of emphasis and focus on video technology, AI, video management. They see that as a future, and quite frankly, I can't disagree. I think video is going to play a huge role in communications going forward. However, one of the things the statement said and the spokesperson said is they understand that many folks aren't using the Vigilon video management or control center, or the Indigo Vision control center, management system, and they need a different option. And so that's where things like the Pelco solution and equipment can come in, where they can use that for video surveillance. But this poses the question: why are these closed systems? And this is my concern as somebody who's a big believer in technology and open standards, is why can't we take an Vigilon or an Indigo Vision, and why through open APIs can't they interconnect with other equipment, with other systems, with other CAD systems? Why is it proprietary? This is the thing that I think needs to change. And I implore everybody who's looking at investing in technology, and certainly agencies who are looking at this, to make sure that they have the flexibility that they need when they purchase these products to be able to use the technology they want, and that they're going to be able to make changes in the future, so they're not stuck with a particular technology for some long period of time, and not locked into potentially high cost contracts, or contracts that become high cost because you're locked into a certain provider and it's much more expensive to switch. So that's what I would like to see. So kudos to Motorola for focusing on this area and investing in this tech. But let's make this stuff open. Let's make it based on open standards and assure that agencies have the benefit of picking the technology that's right for them. Back to the policing. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on with policing in America. We talk about this every week and some of the updates in the laws and everything. Well, today I just want to quickly go over a study that was done by the Justice Collaborative Institute, Data for Progress. It talks about 10 ways to reduce reliance on police and policing in our communities to effectuate the same or better outcomes. So it's not about the defunding or necessarily even major changes in legislation, but it's, shouldn't we leverage police for the things that police are good at? Right. So one of the things that has happened with policing over time, right, is, and former Dallas Police Chief David Brown, he's quotes saying, "We're asking cops to do too much in this country. We are. Every social failure we put off on cops to solve." You know, the dog's loose and got out, call the police. You know, there's a homeless person, call the police. There's drunkenness, call the police. Somebody with a mental illness is missing, call the police. And that's putting a lot, that has put a lot on our law enforcement system, things that aren't really ever really intended to be law enforcement duties, or things that they're necessarily good at or trained at or that they want to deal with, right? And anybody in law enforcement is watching, you know better than anybody else. There's some of these things that, arguably you'd appreciate them taking them off your plate. So here's 10 things to think about. I'm not endorsing one or the other, but I'm putting it out there, putting out the facts, the data, because that's what I do. Boom, 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 boom. We're gonna go through this rapid fire in terms of the kinds of alternative options there are to reduce reliance on policing. So starting with mental health workers to respond to crises. We've talked about this many, many times already in the last several weeks, using social workers, EMS, other healthcare professionals to deal with things like addiction and mental illness and those kinds of claims. Get them directly dispatched from 911. Personally, I think there's a lot of value here if done in the right way. And we have a lot of data, as we've said, with a number of programs around the country that are doing this and have been doing this very successful. This one's also very popular with voters. According to the study, over 68% of respondents would be in favor of establishing a new first responder agency, so to speak, that's made up of mental health professionals for these kinds of things. Number two, violence interrupters. So what are violence interrupters? Violence interrupters to reduce gun violence and other violence in cities. So these are things like job assistance and peer mentoring programs and community support. And so there's ways to integrate these kinds of programs into communities to effectively prevent the violence before it happens, to refocus people, to get them trained, right? These are true community involvement types of and build up types of programs. Baltimore, for example, implemented a violence interruption program, and it reduced serious violence by 69% in a particular area, and that's serious. I mean, you got to look at that. Reduce violence 69%. That's phenomenal. There was one study in New York City that found the gun violence rate declined significantly in 2 neighborhoods operating violence interruption programs. So we're getting to see some data that this works. And quite frankly, the presence of police, while oftentimes there's an intent to de-escalate, just the mere presence of law enforcement can have the opposite effect. And we've seen this time and time again, in some cases, escalates the violence. So, we have to figure out the best ways to address this. And so some of these community programs might really be effective in reducing violence. Number 3, unarmed traffic patrols. This one's a bit controversial, but there's some interest here too. Berkeley, California, I believe, has got a proposal right now to use Department of Transportation and Public Works officials to do parking enforcement, to do minor traffic stops for, failure to obey stop signs, failure to obey lights, this kind of thing. And they're even talking about potentially training some of these workers to deal with drug addiction and other, issues when they come across traffic violations dealing with addiction or intoxication or other things along those lines. Now at the same time, traffic stops can be exceedingly dangerous, and often they can be, lead to identification of criminals that have committed other crimes, right? And so, this one requires, I think, a balance, and we need to see what kind of rules you could put in place. But, there's something to be said about potentially being able to leverage in in certain circumstances, non-law enforcement to deal with day-to-day traffic-related incidents with the community. So, something to think about. Crime labs. So this is something that, I've heard a little bit about, but something called examiner bias. And one of the concerns is that when you have a crime lab associated with a police precinct or policing department, that the outputs of the scientific study in the labs might have some level of bias in them because of that relationship. I don't have any facts to say one way or the other, how often that really happens or not. But there is concern that that does happen, and that rather crime lab should be outsourced to independent third-party functionaries. So, we do this everywhere, right? We do this in our financial audits for public and private corporations have third parties come in. We do third-party testing for technology and for wireless technology and LTE, right? You have to go to a third-party testing facility in order to make sure it does what it really does. So does it make sense to have third-party scientists provide true objectivity when dealing with evidence in crime? And as long as you've got the right rules in place and you have the preservation of the chain of custody and preservation of evidence, and you have rules in place, this might be something to consider, that it reduces the perception of bias or actual bias among examiners. So that's interesting. Number 5, funding better and safer transit services. So there's been a big movement that there's concern that transportation police and law enforcement are not necessary and actually don't reduce violence or reduce crime related to transportation. And so instead of using transit police, use licensed government and civilian workers. So for example, if you've got to check on the licensing of the local pizza joint that's sitting down there in Penn Station, but you don't need police to do any of that, right? You certainly don't need traffic cops to go and check all the licensing of the businesses and those kinds of things. And when it comes to crime prevention, police presence, again, it could reduce, but in some cases could also instigate violence. And so couldn't you have more Department of Transit personnel riding the trains, riding the buses as a deterrent, and then be able to reach out to law enforcement when necessary if there's a need for escalation? Again, something to think about. I mean, in terms of the day-to-day, kind of mundane things that happen, within, the various transportation industries and modalities that police have to deal with and transit cops have to deal with. It may make sense to say, hey, someone else should deal with that, and we're going to come in when we're really needed. Again, something to consider, and a way to potentially have to reduce reliance and so many different obligations on police. School wellness centers. So we're all familiar with school resource officers, the COPS program, community-oriented policing services. They're at my kids' schools, locally. Every one of them's got a separate dedicated cop. And the question is that effectuating the outcomes we want? Could we invest more in counselors? Could we invest more in other community services to deal with the children at these schools who are having difficulties, who might be engaged in violence or drug addiction, or rather than, again, a police presence, which can either escalate or where, police are really looking at investigating and seeking out bad behavior. Whereas when you look at it, especially from a kid's perspective, a child perspective, where counselors may be involved more in the day-to-day from a constructive, preventing those kinds of things from ever happening. Again, I don't know, that might not work in every type of school situation, but do we want to think about that, in the right situations where that's where we should be investing more money, and be probably cheaper at the end of the day to invest in those types of resources than having to dedicate police force to every one of these schools, every day. So again, very interesting idea, this concept of student safety coaches, who are trained in de-escalation, counselors, trained in mental illness, that kind of stuff, bringing positive relationships to the table. I don't know. Dispute resolution experts for neighborhoods and domestic disputes. So neighborhood and domestic disputes, according to at least this study, make up about 50% of all calls. And very few of them actually end up in arrests, and most are nonviolent. So do we need police coming to these? Is that what we need them to do? So come to the house because the neighbors are fighting, or because there's an argument going on in the home? And can you have civilian or other non-police personnel who are responding, who are trained to deal with this in de-escalation techniques, in negotiation, in conflict resolution? And you may be able to do that, again, much less expensively than the cost of having to allocate police officers who we would rather have focusing on truly, more serious kinds of offenses and crimes that are going on in a particular area. So, again, something to think about. Number 8, support for homelessness. And this kind of dovetails with the first one we talked about, I think, a little bit with social workers, but you could have a dedicated kind of group of people who deal with the homelessness problem. And in my mind, homelessness for the most part isn't a police issue. Shouldn't be, right? This isn't about folks committing crimes and being put in jail, putting in the drunk tank, or what have you. These could be people with mental illnesses who are down on their luck, who have any drug addiction, any number of issues, and they need help, right? And so maybe having trained folks who are going out and working with these homeless folks to try to improve their situation. That might be another way to kind of reduce our reliance on police. Number 9, integrated crisis centers. So think about the situation where somebody's having a mental issue, a breakdown. Police come, they have to go to a judge, look about getting a 48-hour commitment, a hold, uses court resources, uses judge resources. What about having these integrated crisis drop-off centers? And this is interesting to me, where they have no rejection policy for anybody in crisis. And rather than this be a criminal in nature, it becomes healthcare in nature. And that whether it's law enforcement or somebody else can bring these individuals to these drop-off centers who then get the help they need. And they're kind of community-based mental health programs. I think that's interesting. I think that could be something that is worthwhile to consider. And apparently voters agree with me on this, because according to the survey, 76% of respondents could see this, an integrated drop-off center, as a very positive thing for the community. And then finally, simple property offenses. Can we train the civilian officer to deal with, when you got a past forged bill or you've got a stolen bicycle, who are trained in investigative techniques and can canvass the neighborhoods and can walk the neighborhoods and but are paid professionals? Do that need to be police? I mean, the reality is, when a bike's stolen, how often is that recovered by police? And it takes up their time to come and do a report. Could we have alternatives to that? Again, where there's nonviolent, there's not a risk of injury, and people who are specifically trained in these types of investigative techniques. Why not? Right? Hey, listen, these are all food for thought. These are all things to think about. And so that's what I'm here for. I'm here to put the food on the table. It's up to you whether you're going to eat it. You understand what I'm saying? I am about knowledge, and I'm about keeping an open mind. So with that said, I am Jason Karp, Esquire. This week's episode of PSN News of the Week. It's been a pleasure as always. Please come back and join me next week. Who knows what's going to happen this week, but whatever it is, we're going to bring it to you. We'll see you then.